arterial supply of spinal cord. Here you can see the whole view of the spinal cord. The left one here, that is the anterior view of the spinal cord, and the right one will show the posterior view of the spinal cord. The spinal cord and its roots and nerves are supplied with blood by both longitudinal and segmental vessels. Three major longitudinal vessels, one anterior and two posterior spinal arteries, originate intracranially from the vertebral artery. You can see the vertebral artery over here. Now the anterior spinal artery forms the fused anterior spinal branches of the vertebral artery and descends in the ventral median fissure of the cord. Each posterior spinal artery originates either directly from the ipsilateral vertebral artery or its posterior inferior cerebellar branch, this one, and descends in a posterolateral sulcus of the cord. Here again, this is the anterior and posterior part. This is the anterior spinal artery, and here you can see the posterior spinal artery. Here what you are shown here is the left posterior spinal artery. So segmental arteries, they are derived in a craniocaudal sequence from the spinal branches of vertebral artery, deep cervical artery, posterior intercostal arteries, and lumbar arteries. These vessels these forms the segmental arteries, and these vessels enter the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramina, which is shown here, and anastomose with the branches of the longitudinal vessels to form a pial plexus on the surface of the cord. The segmental spinal arteries send anterior and posterior radicular branches. This one is the anterior radicular branch and this one is the posterior radicular branch to the spinal cord along the ventral and dorsal nerve roots. Most anterior radicular branches are small and end in the ventral nerve roots. Here you can see this is the ventral nerve roots or in the pial plexus of the cord. The small posterior radicular branches also supply the dorsal root ganglia, which is shown over here. Branches enter at both the ganglionic poles to be distributed around ganglion cells and nerve fibers. These are the two ends. It will be supplying at both ends of the dorsal root ganglia. And some radicular arteries, mainly situated in the lower cervical, lower thoracic and upper lumbar regions, are large enough to reach the ventral median fissure, where they divide into slender ascending and large descending branches. So these are the anterior radicular artery. Some of them in these regions will be dividing into slender ascending branch and a large descending branch. These are the anterior radiculomedullary feeder arteries. They anastomose with the anterior spinal arteries to form, here is the anterior spinal artery, they anastomose with that to form a single or partly double longitudinal vessel of uneven caliber. That's very important. Anterior spinal artery is of uneven caliber, as you can see here, along the ventral median fissure of the spinal cord. And now one of them is important, and that one is the great anterior radiculomedullary artery of Adam-Kiewicz. That is the largest anterior medullary feeder, and the origin varies in level. They are arising from a spinal branch of, in this picture we can assume this is the artery of Adam-Kiewicz, and in this anterior view this will be the artery of Adam-Kiewicz. So the origin varies and it is arising from a spinal branch of either one of the lower posterior intercostal arteries T9 to 11, or of the subcostal artery T12, or less frequently of the upper lumbar arteries L1 and L2. It mostly arises on the left side, which is shown in the picture, and on reaching the spinal cord, it sends a branch. Here you can see it sends a branch to the anterior spinal artery and another to anastomose with the ramus of the posterior spinal artery, here going, which lies anterior to the dorsal roots, that we will be seeing later. It may be the main supply to the lower thirds of the cord. Here is the lower third of the cord, which is shown within the blue box. Now, the central branches of the anterior spinal artery enter the ventral median fissure and then turn right or left to supply the ventral gray column, which is shown here, the base of the dorsal gray column. This is the dorsal gray column, the base will be around here, including the dorsal nucleus, which will be around this region, and the adjacent white matter adjacent to the gray columns. Each posterior spinal artery, you can see the posterior view of spinal cord over here. Each posterior spinal artery contributes to a pair of longitudinal anastomotic channels anterior and posterior to the dorsal spinal roots. This is the dorsal spinal root, and these longitudinal anastomotic channels are anterior and posterior to the dorsal nerve root. They are reinforced by the posterior medullary feeders from the posterior radicular arteries, which you have mentioned earlier. The latter are variable in number and size, but smaller, more numerous, and more evenly distributed than the anterior medullary feeders. The anterior channel is joined. Anterior channel means this one showing over here, the anterior anastomotic channel, is joined by a ramus from the descending branch of the great anterior segmental medullary artery of Adam Gewicks, which you have mentioned earlier. Now, in all longitudinal spinal arteries, the width of the lumen is uneven. We have already mentioned that. And complete interruptions can occur. It may not be a continuous line. At the conus medullaris, which is the lower portion of the spinal cord, they communicate by anastomotic loops. And lastly, there is the intramedullary arteries, which is going to supply the innermost region of the spinal cord. The central branches of the anterior spinal artery, this is the anterior spinal artery, and these are the central branches. They supply about 2/3 of the cross-sectional area of the anterior part of the cord. Almost this much region will be supplied. The rest of the dorsal gray and white columns and peripheral parts of lateral and ventral white columns are supplied by numerous small radial vessels that branch from posterior spinal arteries and the pial plexus. That is, around this region and this peripheral white column region will be supplied by the posterior spinal and the pial plexus. Thank you.